we're going to talk about worklessness, state of worklessness, and then we'll talk about what the state has come up with to deal with worklessness with regards to the welfare state and how important that is. So how many people are at work in Britain, and what does the picture look like?
What does it look like? So one of the big stats over the last year or so, and it was sort of true for this government and the last months and years, I suppose, of the government before, is there are about 10 million people, working age people in the UK who are not in work, who are economically inactive. So they're not in work and they're not looking for work. So that's about 1 in 5 adults. And there are lots of reasons for that. So you've got a lot of students who are, getting on with their work. You've got people in caring for elderly relatives or caring for children who opting out of the workforce. But one of the big concerns is the rising number of people who are long-term sick. And so of that 10 million, about a third, bit under a third, are long-term sick. And that's been growing for a while. And it's not just the number, it's the makeup of that group as well. So historically, you would expect it's older workers with, maybe physical labor with back problems or something like that. And that's still a fairly significant portion. But the major growth is now happening in young people, which is a real concern. And it's often related to mental health problems. But that has risen. So, going back to the boys thing slightly, if you look at young people not in education, employment or training, since the pandemic, from pre-pandemic figures, you're looking at a rise of 40% in young men. It's risen in young women too, but it's only risen by about 7%. But in young men, there has been a massive rise recently. And it's a sort of the big economic question. I hesitate to say this, having just had the conversation about GDP and how it rules everything, but it is not good to be out of work, particularly as a young man or woman. It has a long scarring effect if you are out of work when you're young. And so it is one of the big questions that the government is trying to get to grips with at the moment, is how you get this large cohort of young people back into the workforce and doing something. I think one of the slightly unspoken bits of all this as well is that I mentioned GDP there. The drive of a lot of this is GDP. It is growth. The government's been very clear. Its number one priority is growth. But the really important bit here is actually about purpose. It's about having a reason to get up in the morning. It's about agency. It's building your own life. It's, being able to take on responsibility for a family or a mortgage or whatever it might be. And so it links really closely to that family conversation we've had and that father conversation, that they're sort of two sides of the same coin, that as you get a good job and you can build your life and have a family and take care of them and things like that, so they play off each other. But in areas of the country where you don't have work or people aren't working for whatever reason, actually building that society, starting with those foundation stones, doesn't tend to happen as much. And I think it's becoming a real concern to see that is the future mapping out for a lot of young people.
And the welfare state, the use of it has gone through the roof, mapping very closely to what you just described about the number of people out of work. Which parts of the welfare state do you think are a net positive when it comes to supporting people back into work? And which do you think are a net negative and both a money pit and not good for human agency?
Yeah, it's a really difficult one, this. So at the moment, there's this big fight going on over whether you scrap the 2-child limit or you put more money on various other caps and things. And there's an important baseline of a safety net to say that if you fall out of work, we as a society do want to help you. And we want to make sure you're not destitute, right? So what can we do to do that? So there is a part where that's really important. But what slightly worries me is so much of that conversation is about where do we put more handouts in the system rather than how do we help people build their own lives. So just to give you a sort of nuts and bolts example of that, the cost of scrapping the 2-child limit will be about 3.5 billion. It's quite expensive to do. If I just gave you 3.5 billion and said, how would you solve poverty? You probably wouldn't put it there. You would look at, there are 5 million people in the UK who are basically illiterate and innumerate. You might put it into adult education. We have huge problems of addiction in the UK at the moment, both substance and gambling and other things like that. Actually, if you give someone with those problems more money, you're really not helping them. There are lots of other things that are holding people back that 3.5 million could address, that just giving as a handout isn't necessarily the ideal thing to do. So ultimately, the point where you come to on this sort of giving money to people in trouble side is that it is a political decision. it's a really hard decision. You see how much money you've got, and you've got to put it where it works best. The second side of it, though, and the really important side, and the bit that often goes missing, is that if someone is out of work, and particularly out of work long term, how do we get them back into work? And I think too often what I see is trying to use those financial levers to push people in. So if we reduce benefits, will that get them back into work? Or if we increase that, or how do we manipulate the welfare system to get people into work? But when we work, I mentioned we work with a lot of small charities who work with people who are coming out of prison or who are long-term unemployed. It always, always, always starts with a trusted relationship. When somebody has been out of work for a long time, if they don't have any relationships around them, they will stay out of work. If you start giving them trusted relationships, they will find their way back. It is really, it's almost the sort of the magic secret sauce that no one quite fully understands. But whether you're working with, I don't know, one of the absolute classics is women that take time out of work to have children, and they haven't been in the workforce for 5 or 6 years maybe, and they're looking to get back. Often the thing that will change is confidence, that they don't have the confidence to work anymore. And actually meeting other women who have been in that situation and got back into work can give them the confidence. Simply taking away their benefits doesn't change their confidence level, or giving them more doesn't help them. But having that person in their life that can give them the confidence to show that this is possible and they can get back to work becomes really important. And we see it in so much of our work. Same with people coming out of prison. Like, give them a trusted relationship and a reason to get up in the morning. It doesn't work if you don't have one of those two. So you need that trusted relationship with the job, someone who can coach them, bring them along. So in terms of what that looks like for governments, there are these schemes that sort of roll out very small scale. So I think the last government spent about 300 million on something called universal support, which tries to give people those support mechanisms. But when you compare it to the overall DWP bill of, it's getting on for $1/3 billion in the next few years. It's $1/3 trillion. Is nearly 300 billion over the next few years. It will be massive, the DWP bill, and what we spend in benefits and pensions and all the rest. The amount we are spending on those more relational things to give people support to get into work is really quite small. And I think that is probably the undersold bit and where a lot more focus needs to be.